I stood in my garden, holding a wilting hydrangea, when a stranger in a hard hat told me my home was no longer mine. My own daughter, Tiffany, had sold my 35-year dream for a pile of designer clothes and a penthouse in Chicago. I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, I walked to my father's old desk and pulled out a single dusty piece of paper. It was a secret lakefront trust that she never knew existed. With one quiet phone call to my lawyer, I turned her $1 million lifestyle into a legal hurricane. Today, Tiffany is not wearing silk or gold. She is shivering in a cold wooden shack in the woods, while I sit on my new porch watching the sunset. It is funny how a single signature can turn a designer dress into a tattered rag. Before I tell you how this quiet librarian outsmarted a $1 million developer, please leave a comment and tell me which state you are watching from. Is it sunny or rainy where you are today? I can still close my eyes and smell it. The scent of aged paper, wood glue, and a hint of winter pine that always seemed to cling to the heavy oak doors of the library. For 35 years, that was my world. I was the head librarian in a small, quiet town nestled in the green mountains of Vermont. It was a life measured in whispers, the soft thud of book stamps, and the gentle rustle of pages being turned. People think being a librarian is just about sitting in a chair and reading all day. But they do not see the weight of the work. For 3.5 decades, I stood on my feet, shelving thousands of stories while my own story remained on hold. My back ached, and my hands grew calloused from the dry dust of the archives. But I never complained. Not once. You see, I had a secret. Every single paycheck I received, no matter how small, was a brick in a wall. It was a step closer to the lake. I was not a woman who spent money on fancy things. While my friends were buying new sedans and taking cruises to the Caribbean, I was clipping coupons at the kitchen table. I wore the same wool coat for 10 winters. I mended my own socks by the light of a single lamp to save on the electric bill. My neighbors probably thought I was a bit of a hermit. They saw me walking to work in the rain and driving a car that was 20 years old. But I did not care. I had a vision in my mind that kept me warm. It was a small cedar shingle cottage on the edge of the water. I wanted a place where the only sound was the cry of a loon at dawn and the soft lap of the waves against a wooden dock. I called it my sanctuary. It was not just a piece of real estate. To me, that cottage was a trophy. It was a medal of honor for every hour of overtime I worked and every luxury I denied myself. I remember sitting in the library during the quiet evening hours, looking at pictures of lake houses in old magazines. I would tell myself that one day, I would not be reading about someone else's piece. I would be living my own. I saved every nickel. I saved every dime. I watched my bank account grow with the patience of a mountain. 35 years is a very long time to wait for a dream. But as I reached the end of my career, the dream was finally within my reach. I had the money. I had the plan. I was ready to trade the dusty shelves for the fresh air of the lake. I thought the hard part was over. I thought that because I had worked so hard and been so honest, the universe would finally let me rest. I had no idea that the greatest threat to my peace was not a lack of money. It was the person I loved most in the world. The day I finally held the keys to that cottage was the proudest moment of my entire life. I remember standing on the creaky wooden porch, feeling the cool breeze coming off Lake Champlain. It was a crisp October afternoon. The trees were a fire of orange and gold. I had spent 35 years dreaming of that exact smell of wet earth and pine. I felt like I had finally reached the finish line. I had done it. I was 65 years old, and I finally owned a piece of heaven. For the first few months, life was perfect. I spent my mornings drinking black coffee and watching the mist rise off the water. I spent my afternoons digging in the dirt, planting the blue and purple hydrangeas I had always wanted. I was a librarian who finally had her own quiet corner of the world. But as the seasons changed, my body began to remind me that I was not a young woman anymore. It started with a slight blur. At first, I thought I just needed a stronger pair of reading glasses from the drugstore. But soon, the words on my favorite novels began to swim on the page. The letters grew fuzzy. They were distant and unreachable. When I went to the doctor in town, he told me it was cataracts. He said they were progressing quickly. The world became a hazy, watercolor painting. The vibrant blue of the lake turned into a dull grey. But the most frightening part was not the scenery. It was the paperwork. You see, being a homeowner in America means dealing with a mountain of documents. There are property taxes. There are insurance forms from the agency in Montpelier. There are utility bills and maintenance contracts. For a woman who spent her life organizing books, being unable to read a simple invoice was a special kind of torture. That was when Tiffany started visiting more often. My daughter had always been a city girl. She loved the noise of New York and the flash of expensive things. She had never shown much interest in my quiet life at the lake. But suddenly, she was there every weekend. She would bring me lunch. She would help me pull weeds in the garden. She was so kind. She was so attentive. I felt so lucky to have a daughter who cared. One evening, while we were sitting by the fireplace, Tiffany brought out a folder of papers. She sat close to me and took my hand. Her voice was soft, like a gentle lullaby. She told me that she was worried about me. She said she did not want me to lose the house because of a missed tax payment or a legal mistake. She suggested that we put her name on the deed as a joint owner. "It is just a safety net, Mom," she told me. She whispered it as if it were a beautiful secret. "If something happens to you, or if your eyes get worse, I can handle all the boring stuff. I can pay the taxes. I can talk to the lawyers. You can just sit here and be the queen of the lake." I hesitated for a moment. My father had always told me to be careful with my land. But I looked at Tiffany. I looked at my own flesh and blood. I thought to myself, "Martha, you are being a cynical old woman. This is your daughter. She loves you." I sat at the kitchen table. My vision was so poor that the legal document looked like a white sheet of fog. I could not see the fine print. I could not see the traps hidden between the lines. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady because my heart was full of trust. I signed my name on the bottom line. I thought I was securing my future. I thought I was protecting my peace. Tiffany hugged me then. It was a long, tight hug. At the time, I thought it was a hug of love. Now, I know it was the hug of a predator who had finally caught its prey. I had signed a paper that gave her equal power over my sanctuary. I had signed my own eviction notice, and I had done it with a smile on my face. The spring morning was unusually beautiful. The air was sweet with the scent of my blooming hydrangeas. I was out in the garden, wearing my old straw hat and my favorite tattered gardening gloves. My eyes were still blurry. But I knew my flowers by their touch. I was humming an old song I used to hear on the radio when I was a girl. I felt at peace. That peace was shattered by the sound of heavy boots on the gravel driveway. I looked up and saw 3 men. They were wearing expensive grey suits that looked out of place in the woods. They were carrying metal tripods and laser measuring tools. They looked like they were preparing for a war. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked toward them. I asked them if they were lost. I told them this was private property. One of the men, a tall man with a cold face, looked at his clipboard and then looked at me. He did not smile. He told me that they were surveyors for a large development firm out of New York City. "We are just doing the preliminary work for the Harbor View luxury condos," he said. His voice was flat and professional. He said it as if he were talking about the weather. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I told him there must be a mistake. I told him I owned this house and I was not selling it. The man looked at me with something that felt like pity. He told me the property had already been sold. He said the closing happened 2 weeks ago. He told me the new owners wanted to break ground by the end of the month. The world began to spin. I felt like the ground was turning into water beneath my feet. I stumbled back to the house and grabbed my phone. My fingers were shaking so badly I could hardly press the buttons. I called Tiffany. I called her 3 times before she finally picked up. "Tiffany," I whispered. My voice was thick with terror. "There are men in our yard. They are saying the house is sold. Tell me they are wrong. Please. Tell me this is a nightmare." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the city noise in the background. I could hear taxis honking and people laughing. When Tiffany finally spoke, her voice was different. The warmth was gone. The sweetness had evaporated. She sounded like a stranger. "It is not a nightmare, Mum," she said. She sounded bored. She sounded like she was talking to a child who was being difficult. "I sold the place. I had the legal right to do it as a joint owner. The offer was too good to pass up. $1.2 million. Do you have any idea what that kind of money can do for someone in my position?" I could not breathe. I asked her about my dream. I asked her about the 35 years I spent working in that dusty library to afford this one little corner of the world. I asked her where I was supposed to go. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Tiffany snapped. Her voice was sharp now. It cut like a knife. "Dreams do not pay for a lifestyle, Mom. Dreams do not pay for a penthouse or a wardrobe that people actually respect. You are old. You do not need a whole lake. I found a nice assisted living apartment for you in the city. It is near a pharmacy and a bus stop. It is much more practical." I dropped the phone. It clattered on the hardwood floor. I looked out the window and saw the surveyors putting orange stakes into my flower beds. They were staking out the spots where the concrete would be poured. They were measuring the space where my sanctuary used to be. I realized then that my daughter had not just sold a house. She had sold her mother. She had traded my life for a designer label. She had traded my peace for a view of a brick wall in the city. I sat down on the floor and cried. I cried for the librarian who saved every penny. I cried for the mother who believed in her child. But most of all, I cried because I realized that in the eyes of my only daughter, I was worth less than a luxury handbag. The silence that followed Tiffany's words was louder than any scream. I stood there, in the middle of my kitchen, holding a telephone that suddenly felt like a piece of cold, dead plastic. My daughter, my only child. She had just told me that 35 years of my life were nothing more than a bank account for her vanity. Her voice did not sound like the little girl I used to tuck into bed. It did not sound like the teenager I had cheered for at graduation. It was the voice of a stranger, a cold, arrogant woman who had calculated the price of her mother's soul and decided it was worth $1,500,000. $1,500,000, Mom, she repeated. I could almost hear the smirk on her face through the line. "Do you have any idea what that means for me? I am 30 years old. I am in the prime of my life. I am tired of telling people my mother is a librarian in a dusty town. I am tired of wearing clothes from the local mall." I tried to speak. I tried to find the words to ask her how she could do this. But my throat was tight. It felt like I was swallowing broken glass. I finally managed to whisper her name. I asked her about the lake. I asked her about the sunsets she promised I would see. "The sunsets are free, Mom," she snapped. Her patience was gone. "You can watch them from a park bench in the city. I am in a penthouse in New York now. I am looking at the skyline of Manhattan. I have already bought the wardrobe I deserve. I have bags from Hermes. I have dresses from Chanel. I have shoes that cost more than your monthly pension. These are the things that matter in the real world. These are the things that show people who I am." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was not a heart attack. It was the feeling of a heart truly breaking. I realized then that Tiffany did not see me as a person. She saw me as an obstacle. She saw my retirement as a waste of capital. To her, my peace was just a pile of money that was sitting idle. "I found a place for you," she continued. Her voice was flat and professional now. "It is a small apartment in a managed building. It is near the subway. It is practical. You do not need a yard. You do not need a lake. You just need a bed and a chair for your books. I will have your things moved by the end of the week. Do not make this difficult, Mom. The papers are signed. The deal is done." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, listening to the dial tone. It was the sound of my life being erased. I looked around my home. I saw the wooden table my father had built. I saw the bookshelves filled with stories of heroes and villains. I realized that the greatest villain I would ever know was the person I had brought into this world. $1,500,000. That was the price of my sanctuary. Tiffany wanted to step into the high society of New York. She wanted to walk on red carpets and drink expensive champagne, and she was willing to bulldoze her mother's life to do it. I realized that you can never buy enough designer clothes to cover up a hollow heart. Tiffany was wrapped in silk and gold, but she was bankrupt in every way that truly mattered. The apartment in the city was a tomb. It was on the 4th floor of a grey brick building. The only view from my window was another brick wall and a tangled web of fire escapes. There was no wind. There was no smell of pine or fresh water. There was only the constant, low hum of traffic and the smell of exhaust and old trash. I sat in my chair for days. I felt like a ghost. I was surrounded by boxes that I did not want to unpack. Every time I touched a lamp or a picture frame from the cottage, I felt a wave of nausea. I was 65 years old, and I was a prisoner of my own daughter's greed. I spent my nights crying. I missed the sound of the loons. I missed the way the moonlight used to dance on the ripples of the lake. In this dark room, the only light was the flickering neon sign from a deli across the street. I felt like I was waiting to die. I felt like my story had already reached its final tragic page. But then, on a rainy Tuesday, I decided to open the old cedar chest that had belonged to my father. He had been a carpenter, a man of wood and nails, a man who believed that land was the only thing that truly lasted. He had died 20 years ago, but I could still feel his presence when I touched his old tools. At the very bottom of the chest, tucked under a heavy wool blanket, I found a leather folder. It was sealed with old red wax. My father had given it to me years ago, telling me to keep it safe. "For a rainy day, Martha," he had said with a wink. I broke the seal. Inside was a collection of yellowed maps and a legal document from 1982. My father had been a very wise man. He had lived through the Great Depression, and he did not trust banks or big corporations. When he originally bought the land for our family, he had done something very clever. He had divided the property into 2 separate pieces. The first piece was the land where the house stood. That was what Tiffany had sold. But the second piece was a narrow strip of land, exactly 50 feet wide, that ran along the entire length of the lakefront. According to this document, the lakefront strip was not part of the main deed. It had been placed into a private, irrevocable trust, and I was the sole trustee. The house belonged to the developer now, but the path to the water, the actual beach, the place where the boats would dock, that belonged to me. I sat there on the floor of that cramped apartment, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of warmth in my belly. I realized what this meant. The developer was planning to build luxury condos. They were selling a waterfront lifestyle to the richest people in the world. But they could not get to the water. They did not own the shore. Tiffany had been so blinded by the $1,500,000 that she had not done her homework. She had assumed that owning the house meant owning the lake. The developers had made the same mistake. They were arrogant. They thought a librarian from Vermont was too simple to understand the law. But my father had protected me from the grave. He had known that one day, someone might try to take my peace away. I looked at the brick wall outside my window and smiled. The shadows of the city did not seem so dark anymore. I reached for my phone. I did not call Tiffany. I did not call the developer. I called a lawyer I had known for 40 years, a man who grew up on the lake and knew the value of a promise. "Henry," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I have something I need you to look at. It seems I own a very expensive piece of dirt, and I am not in the mood to sell it." I realized then that the game was not over. Tiffany had sold my house, but she had sold a lie. She had guaranteed the developers a private beach that she did not possess. I was no longer a victim. I was the person holding the key to a multi-million-dollar disaster, and I was going to make sure that everyone learned the true cost of a betrayal. There is a very specific kind of power in saying nothing at all. As a librarian, I spent my life in silence, but I never realized it could be a weapon until that winter in the city. The developers discovered the truth about the lakefront strip much sooner than I expected. They had already moved their heavy machinery onto the land. They had already started digging up the earth where my hydrangeas used to grow. But when their lawyers sat down to finalize the permits for the private marina and the beach club, they hit a brick wall. That brick wall was my father's trust. Suddenly, my quiet little apartment was not so quiet anymore. It started with a knock on the door. Two men in dark blue suits stood in the hallway, smelling of expensive cologne and desperation. They were from the development group. They did not look at me with pity this time. They looked at me with fear. They opened a leather briefcase and showed me a check. It was for $500,000. "This is just for the easement, Mrs. Miller," the lead lawyer said. He was smiling, but his eyes were twitching. "You keep the land. We just need the right to walk across it. $500,000. You could move into the best retirement community in Florida tomorrow." I looked at the check. I looked at the zeros. 500,000. It was more money than I had earned in a decade at the library. But I did not say a word. I simply stood up, opened my door, and pointed to the hallway. I did not need to speak. My silence told them everything they needed to know. Then came the phone calls from Tiffany. At first, she tried to be sweet. She called me Mommy again, a name she had not used since she was 10 years old. She told me that she had made a mistake, and that we could be a family again if I just signed the beach rights over. She said we could travel the world together. When I did not answer, the sweetness turned into acid. She began to call me at 3 a.m, screaming into the voicemail. She called me a senile old woman. She said I was ruining her future for a pile of dirt. She told me that her penthouse was at stake and that I was being selfish. "I have already spent the deposit, Mom," she shrieked. I could hear the sound of a glass breaking in the background. "If you do not sign that paper, the developers will come after me. Do you want to see your daughter in prison? Is that what you want?" I listened to every message, but I never called her back. I sat in my dark apartment, and I waited. I knew how the world worked. Corporate investors do not like to wait. They do not like uncertainty, and they certainly do not like being lied to. By the end of the month, the project began to crumble. The big banks that were funding the luxury condos saw the legal mess and started pulling their money out. The construction crews stopped working. The orange fences stayed up, but the machines went silent. The development company was furious. They had paid Tiffany $1,500,000 for a waterfront paradise that they could not actually reach. They sued her for fraud. They sued her for misrepresenting the legal status of the land. They sued her for every penny she had and every penny she hoped to have. I was still sitting in my chair in the city, but for the first time I felt like I was back at the lake. The silence was no longer a prison. It was my victory. I realized that Tiffany had sold my peace to buy a life of noise. Now, the noise was coming for her, and she had nowhere to hide. Watching someone's life fall apart is a heavy thing, even when they deserve it. The legal battle against Tiffany was swift and tan hot. The developers had a team of the most expensive lawyers in New York, and Tiffany was trying to fight them with nothing but her pride and a few empty designer handbags. Because she had signed a contract guaranteeing exclusive water access that she did not own, the court found her liable for massive damages. She had already spent nearly half of the $1,500,000 on her penthouse, her Hermes bags, and her Chanel dresses. But the court did not care about her wardrobe. I heard from my lawyer, Henry, that she had to sell everything. The penthouse was the first to go. It was sold at a loss just to cover the initial legal fees. Then came the estate sale. I saw the pictures online. Hundreds of pairs of shoes, silk scarves, and gold jewelry spread out on folding tables for strangers to pick through. Tiffany had traded her mother's heart for those things, and now they were being sold for pennies on the dollar. She lost it all. Every single thing that she thought made her important was gone in less than a year. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a mountain of debt that she could never pay off in her lifetime. While Tiffany was losing her illusion, I was rebuilding my reality. My lawyer had filed a countersuit against the developer for trespassing and damaging my protected lakefront strip. We discovered that they had dumped construction debris on the trust land and destroyed several old-growth trees. The insurance company for the developers did not want a long trial with a grandmotherly librarian as the plaintiff. It would be a public relations disaster for them. So, they offered me a settlement. It was a very large settlement. It was enough to buy back my peace 3 times over. I did not move into a fancy penthouse. I did not buy a designer wardrobe. I went back to the lake. I could not buy back my old cottage because it had already been partially demolished. But I bought the lot right next to it. I hired a local builder, a man who had known my father, to build me a small, sturdy home. We used cedar shingles and high-quality oak. We built a wide, wraparound porch that was twice as big as the old one. I moved in on a warm June afternoon. The smell of the water was the same. The cry of the loon was just as haunting as I remembered. I sat on my new porch and I looked out at the water. My vision was still a bit blurry, but I could see the blue of the lake clearly enough. I was no longer a prisoner in the city. I was back where I belonged. I had a new garden to plant. I had new books to read. And most importantly, I had my dignity. I realized then that Tiffany's greatest mistake was thinking that wealth was something you wear or something you show off. She thought she could buy a soul with a label, but real wealth is the ability to sit in silence and be at peace with yourself. I had my sanctuary back. Tiffany was out there somewhere in the world, still chasing an illusion that had already turned to dust. 2 years had passed since the day I moved into my new cottage. 2 years of quiet mornings. 2 years of watching the seasons paint the lake in different colors. And 2 years of healing. My vision was not perfect, but I could see well enough to appreciate the beauty of a life earned through honesty. I had forgotten the sound of the city traffic. I had forgotten the weight of the grey brick walls. I was finally, truly, at home. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August. The air was heavy with the heat of the summer, and the cicadas were buzzing in the old oak trees. I was sitting on my wide cedar porch, sipping a glass of cold iced tea and listening to the water lap against the shore. My lakefront strip, my father's legacy, was now officially a protected wildlife sanctuary. No condos, no marinas, just the birds, the turtles, and the silence. I saw a figure moving slowly along the public hiking path that bordered the woods. At first, I thought it was just a weary hiker. The woman was walking with a heavy limp. She was wearing a tattered, dirty backpack and a pair of sneakers that were falling apart at the seams. Her skin was burned a dark, angry red by the sun. Her hair was matted and tangled with bits of leaves and dirt. As she drew closer to my gate, she stopped. She looked up at my house. When our eyes met, I felt a cold jolt of recognition. It was Tiffany. But it was not Tiffany who had stood in a New York penthouse wearing silk and diamonds. It was not the woman who had laughed at my librarian life. This woman looked 20 years older than she actually was. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes were sunken and shadowed with a deep, hollow exhaustion. She looked like a ghost that had been wandering in the wilderness for a lifetime. She collapsed at the edge of my garden, her knees hitting the dirt right next to the blue hydrangeas. She did not try to stand up. She just stayed there, sobbing. It was a low, broken sound. It was the sound of someone who had reached the absolute end of their strength. I walked down the steps of the porch. I stood at the gate, looking down at my only child. I did not feel the hot anger I had felt in the city. I did not feel the urge to scream. I felt a strange, quiet emptiness. It was as if she were a character in a book I had read a very long time ago. Tiffany looked up at me, her face wet with tears and dust. She told me that she had lost everything. She whispered that the bank had taken every cent she had. She said she had been living in a makeshift shack in the deep woods for 6 months. She told me she had no heat, no running water, and barely enough food to survive the week. "Mom, please," she sobbed. Her voice was cracked and thin. "I am your daughter. I am your flesh and blood. I have nowhere else to go. The woods are so cold at night. Please, just let me come inside. I will do anything. I will clean. I will garden. Just do not leave me out here." I looked past her, toward the lake. I thought about the 35 years I had spent saving for my dream. I thought about the day she sold my sanctuary to buy a closet full of labels. I thought about the dark apartment where I had sat alone, crying for a home that she had bulldozed for her own vanity. I looked at her tattered backpack and her burnt skin. I told her that life had a very strange way of teaching us what matters. I reminded her of what she had said to me on the phone 2 years ago. I reminded her that she had told me dreams do not pay for anything. I told her that she had traded a mother's love for a designer wardrobe, and now the wardrobe was gone. I gave you a home, Tiffany, I said. My voice was steady. It was calm. It was final. I gave you a lifetime of devotion. But you chose a wardrobe instead. You chose the penthouse and the high society over your own mother. You sold my peace to buy a moment of fashion. She reached out her hand to touch my shoes, begging for mercy. But I stepped back. I told her that my lakefront was now a sanctuary for things that were wild and honest. I told her that perhaps living in that shack would give her the one thing that money could never buy. I told her it would give her time. Time to reflect on the difference between a collection of expensive clothes and a place to call home. The sky is your roof now, Tiffany, I told her. The same sky you told me I could watch from a park bench. I hope you find the answers you are looking for. I turned around and walked back to my porch. I did not look back. I could hear her crying behind me, but the sound was slowly drowned out by the gentle rustle of the leaves and the call of a loon across the water. I went inside my beautiful, sturdy house. I closed the heavy oak door. I locked it, not to keep the world out, but to keep my peace in. For the first time in many years, the silence in my home was not lonely. It was perfect. I realized that you can buy a dress, you can buy a bag, and you can buy a view, but you can never buy a soul. And once you sell the person who loved you most, you have sold your own future. I sat down in my favorite chair, picked up a book, and finally I was at rest. As I sit here on my porch, listening to the soft rustle of the wind in the trees, I realize that life has a very strange way of balancing the scales. We spend our whole lives building something. We work 35 or 40 years. We save our pennies. We skip the luxuries so that, one day, we can finally have a little bit of peace. We think our greatest challenge is the work itself. But sometimes, the hardest part of our journey is realizing that the people we love do not always share our values. Tiffany thought she was being smart. She thought she was being modern. She looked at my life and saw a dusty old librarian who did not understand the real world. To her, the real world was made of leather handbags, expensive shoes, and penthouses with a view of a city that never sleeps. She believed that a designer label could give her a soul. She believed that $1,500,000 could buy her a future. But as the sun sets over the lake today, I can see the truth so clearly. A wardrobe is just clothes. A penthouse is just a box made of glass and steel. But a home is a sanctuary. It is where your memories live. It is where your heart finds rest. When Tiffany sold my piece, she did not realize she was selling her own foundation. She traded a mother's devotion for a moment of fashion. Now, she has the whole sky for a roof. But she has no place to call home. Note: although this story was created to be engaging and easy to understand, the message and the lesson it carries are what truly matter and hold real value. It is a reminder to all of us to protect what we have worked for. It is a reminder to plan carefully and to cherish the values that truly last. Life is not about what you wear. It is about how you treat the people who helped you get where you are. I hope this story has touched your heart. I hope it has reminded you that honesty and patience will always win in the end. If you believe that karma is the ultimate stylist, and that justice eventually finds its way home, please give this video a like. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a betrayal like this? How did you find your peace? We would love to hear your wisdom. Please subscribe to Elderly Stories to join our community. We are here to share the lessons, the laughter, and the truths that only come with time. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me. God bless you, and may you always find your way back to your own sanctuary.